To grow food on Mars, a man had a sudden idea while flushing the toilet. He thought of using dehydrated feces as fertilizer. He opened the package, poured it into a bucket, added water, and stirred it. Though the process was unpleasant, it was the key to successfully growing potatoes. Once ready, he used a spoon to scoop the feces, covered it with soil, and carefully placed potato pieces on top before watering them. He repeated this process hundreds of times, until the entire area was planted because this was his only food source for the next 3 years. The man was on Mars, a barren planet 50 million kilometers away from Earth. He had been left behind by his crew. 2 months earlier, Mark and his teammates had landed on Mars for a mission. However, they encountered a massive storm with wind forces reaching 600 newtons. Their commander, Lewis, immediately ordered an emergency evacuation. As the team headed toward the spacecraft, Mark, who was at the back, was struck by a dislodged antenna receiver. He was thrown into the air and lost consciousness. By the time the crew realized he was missing, the storm had already engulfed him. Lewis tried to locate Mark, but the impact had damaged Mark's spacesuit, rendering communication and tracking devices useless. On Mars, with its unique atmospheric pressure, a damaged suit would leave someone unable to survive for more than a minute. Although the chances of Mark surviving were slim, the crew kept searching. However, the storm grew stronger, and their spacecraft began to tilt dangerously. If they didn't evacuate immediately, everyone would perish. With no other choice, Lewis ordered the crew to board the spacecraft. After successfully docking with the Hermes space station, Lewis reported Mark's presumed death to the space agency. Despite their grief, they decided to announce the news publicly out of respect for Mark. No one could have imagined that Mark had miraculously survived both the storm and Mars's atmospheric pressure. The damage to his suit occurred because the antenna pierced his abdomen. Fortunately, the antenna and his blood sealed the tear, preventing air from escaping. Although he survived the pressure, his biggest challenge was treating the wound. Stumbling back to the habitat, he passed through the airlock, removed his suit, and enduring excruciating pain, pulled out the fragments lodged in his body. Despite the agony, he was relieved to find no vital organs were harmed. After basic first aid, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. But a new problem arose. All communication devices were destroyed, and no one knew he was still alive. Alone on Mars, Mark refused to give up. He started planning how to survive for as long as possible. He knew that the next mission to Mars would not launch for another 4 years. Until then, he had to figure out how to signal the space agency and find more food. Mark calculated his food supply. At the start of the mission, the agency provided enough food for 6 people for 68 days. That supply could last him over a year, but it wasn't enough to survive until the next mission. One day, while using the toilet, he had an idea. He decided to grow potatoes from the fresh stock meant for Thanksgiving. He also collected dehydrated feces to use as fertilizer. Mark then built a makeshift greenhouse in the habitat, spread a thick layer of Martian soil, and buried cut-up potato pieces in it. Although he solved the issues of temperature and nutrients, water remained the biggest challenge. Each cubic meter of soil required enough water to sustain healthy plant growth. Fortunately, Mark wasn't just an excellent astronaut, but also a botanist and chemistry instructor. He figured out how to produce water by burning hydrogen and oxygen. The habitat's oxygen generator solved the oxygen issue, but obtaining hydrogen required some creative thinking. After much consideration, he realized he could extract it from rocket fuel. To produce a water source on the barren surface of Mars, a man used the chemistry knowledge he learned in middle school. He extracted hydrazine fuel from the spacecraft, used rare metals as a catalyst, and separated the hydrogen from the hydrazine using a drip method. The hydrogen was then channeled into a designated container and burned with oxygen to generate precious water through the combustion reaction. However, he overlooked a critical issue: the oxygen he exhaled. Learning from his past mistakes, this time he donned his spacesuit and fully equipped himself before reigniting the water production device. As the device operated, water droplets began to accumulate on the plastic covering his experimental farm, finally solving his irrigation problem. With this hurdle overcome, he needed only to maintain the farm and patiently wait for enough food to sustain himself until rescue arrived. During his downtime, he repaired facilities damaged by storms, his spirits lifted by the prospect of having a stable food supply. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA believed he had perished. They even held a solemn funeral in his honor. When everyone was convinced of his death, a Mars communications operator noticed something strange through satellite images. A rover that should have been parked on an open plain had mysteriously moved near the habitat, and the sand-covered solar panels had been meticulously cleaned. These signs strongly suggested that the man might still be alive. Once this was confirmed, NASA faced a major dilemma. They lacked the technology to rescue him in a short amount of time. The next Mars mission would take at least 4 years to reach him, but his food supply likely wouldn't last that long. To address this, NASA decided to send a supply ship carrying food. However, building even a simple ship would take at least 6 months, and the man would have to survive on his current supplies until the delivery arrived. Meanwhile, the man himself, using his extensive agricultural knowledge, had successfully grown potatoes. He managed to multiply his crop from just a dozen plants to several times that amount. He set aside the larger potatoes as food and replanted the smaller ones. Despite his agricultural success, he never lost sight of his main goal: to leave Mars. His next challenge was to establish contact with Earth after all his communication equipment had been destroyed. He remembered the Pathfinder, a probe that landed on Mars in 1997, which was equipped with a transmission device for capturing images of the Martian surface. Determined, he embarked on a long journey to find the Pathfinder. After an exhausting search, he finally located it, brought it back to his habitat, and connected it to a power source. On Earth, NASA had already prepared the Pathfinder control system and received the first signal. To ensure communication was successful, the man wrote simple messages on paper using a pen. Communication was eventually established through a clever method. He arranged the alphabet around the device and used a simple encoding and decoding system to transmit messages. With NASA's guidance, he upgraded the communication system by connecting it to the rover's advanced equipment for more efficient exchanges. Through his efforts, he informed NASA that he was safe and had enough food to survive for the next 4 years. Amid his achievements and the miracles he created on Mars, one night as he returned to his habitat, an unexpected incident occurred. The astronaut on Mars celebrated his precious potato harvest. Although he had labeled and neatly organized all the potatoes, they were only enough to sustain him for about 500 days. Meanwhile, NASA's food supplies would take 800 days to arrive. Facing this 300-day gap, the man did not panic. Instead, he enjoyed 3 meals a day, more heartily than before. This was because he had developed a self-sustaining potato farm on Mars. Each plant grew lushly, producing plump and round potatoes. With careful planning and replanting, he was confident he could survive until the supplies arrived. However, one night disaster struck. During a sudden accident in the airlock chamber, Mark was thrown several times before coming to a stop. Fortunately, his spacesuit reduced the impact, and he did not suffer severe injuries. However, his helmet cracked from the collision. To survive Mars's low-pressure environment, he quickly sealed the crack with tape. Ignoring the pain, he rushed back to his habitat. Unfortunately, his potato farm had been destroyed by Mars' 60°C temperature, freezing all the plants to death. Seeing the food source that had sustained him destroyed, Mark felt despair. Losing the farm meant his plan to wait for rescue had failed. NASA, upon learning of his situation, was also at a loss, as there was still a 300-day gap before supplies could arrive. They couldn't imagine how Mark would survive. After enduring various life-and-death challenges, Mark decided to remain strong. He cleared the soil in his habitat and found some potatoes that were still salvageable. Using plastic, he sealed the destroyed doors and resumed his unfinished experiments. During his free time, he communicated with his team remotely, spending his days meaningfully. Meanwhile, NASA worked tirelessly. They accelerated the construction of a spacecraft, reducing its usual 6-month timeline to just 45 days. On the day of the launch, everyone anxiously awaited the results. Unfortunately, the spacecraft experienced a propulsion malfunction, resulting in an explosion. Hearing this news, Mark felt devastated but prepared himself for any outcome. A NASA technician then discovered a solution: to use the Hermes spacecraft, which was returning to Earth, to deliver supplies and return to Mars within 500 days. Mark would need to travel to the Ares landing site and wait for Hermes to arrive in Mars orbit. Although the plan was risky, the Hermes crew unanimously agreed to carry out the mission, even if it meant defying NASA's orders. When Mark learned of the mission, he regained hope. With NASA's guidance, he modified his vehicle to carry essential life support equipment and embarked on a 50-day journey to the launch site. However, a new challenge emerged. The spacecraft had to reduce its weight by 500 kilograms to approach Mars orbit. Mark had to remove almost all equipment from the spacecraft, including windows and other panels. On the day of the launch, Mark, dressed in his best attire, bid farewell to Mars and began his journey toward orbit. The Hermes spacecraft successfully approached, but there was still a 68-kilometer gap. The Hermes crew devised a risky plan, using a controlled explosion to bring the spacecraft closer to Mark's. After a tense and challenging effort, Mark was finally rescued by Hermes' captain, Louise. After 500 days on Mars, Mark finally returned to Earth. He wept, not out of fear, but from the joy of reuniting with the team that had fought so hard to save him. This rescue became a symbol of perseverance, teamwork, and the miracles of human exploration.